Boardroom Bound, episode 189, The Four Pillars of Board Effectiveness with Didier Cossin.
You see, ESG, in my view, is very fundamental. And it's a sign that we have moved, and we are moving from a world of what I would call mechanical governance. Separation, CEO, chair, number of independent, number of gender diversity on the board, mechanical governance towards what I would call a values-based governance.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's episode, we're speaking with Didier Cossin, and he is a lifelong professor of governance, has a huge amount of experience, not just in the classroom, but working with boards on a daily basis. He's a governance expert, and he's educating, advising asset owners and boards around the world, constantly on the move for all the organizations that are pulling him in. He's also the author of a great book, High Performance Boards. He's going to be sharing all of his best practice insights and ideas with us today. There's going to be a lot to take in. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the Modern Board Director Candidate Packaging and Modern Board Operations Knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Didier Cossin, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Alexander.
And for me, it is such a small world, right? So as if you were sitting right here next to me all the way over in Switzerland in your evening time, and I am delighted to share you with the global audience today because this is going to be a rich conversation as someone who lives and breathes this stuff as a governance expert where you are educating and advising asset owners and boards all around the world, clearly doing some great work at the academic institution that's highly regarded of IMD in what you're doing in this space as well. But I get very excited. So before I jump into that, let's step back for a second. Please, I realize you've been at IMD for a long time. You've been teaching this for a ways, but let's sort of start with the beginning. So your academic credentials, some of the work you did, and maybe how you grew into this space over at IMD in terms of Global Board Center and what you guys are doing there.
Thank you. So I came to the U.S. for my graduate education that was really in mathematical finance at the time. I actually started in economics at MIT. At the same time, I was teaching French poetry at Harvard. And then I went into a PhD that was really finance with a gentleman that received a Nobel Prize later on derivatives, on sophisticated financial instruments, mathematical finance. But after my studies, I realized that, and I became a specialist of risks, if you want, but I realized that, the big risks of the world are not interest rates, are not stock prices, they're not even climate or geopolitics. The biggest risk is our capacity to make the right decision in front of risk. And I became a specialist of governance quite early, working first with boards of large financial institutions around the world because I had the technical knowledge, but then engaging quite quickly boards of influential organizations all over, whether, you talk about sovereign wealth funds or whether you talk about non-profits or about large asset owners, still financial institutions, and that very much on the different continents. It's been in Asia quite a bit, in the Middle East, in America. I was just last week in New York to work with a CEO and chair new pairing. And I was just in London. I just flew back from London today working with philanthropic organization. So all types of organizations. I've worked with central banks, with ministries, with many different types. And across different cultures, it goes, in Africa, in Latin America, etc. And I have come to think that governance and if you think governance fundamentally, and governance as what I would call the art of decision making at the top of organization. Governance comes from a word that means the rudder of a boat originally. And if you think about governance as the art of decision making, of giving direction, right? The art of decision making at the top of organizations, it's a very, very human process. And it's a human process of getting to the right answer to the right question sometime on board or whatever governance body is at stake. And that process has to be based on what I would call the dialectic process. Alexander, there is three ways truly to come to the truth, to the right decision, three ways. The first one is rhetoric. The first one is someone knows the truth and convinces the others. But in most business matters today, in most organizational matters today, there is not one holder of the truth. The second way to get to the truth is what we call scientific. It's based on data. But even in the most technical matters, like, let's say, mergers and acquisitions, we know well that a discounted cash flow will not give you the right acquisition. It's much more sensitive than that. It deals with integration, with culture, and it's hard to have a scientific base. And thus, if you don't have the rhetoric way, if you don't have the scientific way, there is only one third way in human capability to get to the truth, and it's dialectic. It's that discussion of peers, of different knowledge, of different perspectives to bring to a higher level the discussion and the decision. Hence the process of governance at the top of organization through constructive dissent.
That is a wonderful way to break it down. I've never heard someone describe it in like that way. So I realize you've been teaching this for a long time. So you were able to take it and distill it down to simple concepts. And, when I think back to your career, so you've been at IMD over a quarter of a century teaching this stuff. When people think about, say, governance today, if you put that word out there, they'd probably stick it within the ESG framework. And granted, ESG means different things to different people. They go, okay, the G, the governance, I get it in there. ESG, we could argue it probably took off dramatically and has changed and accelerated exponentially since COVID started for many different reasons. But if we go back, say that the 25 years you started at IMD and you've been teaching governance for that long, it would probably felt very different back then, right? So if we think in America, the fiduciary rules and the standards that are in place today were very different back then as well. So what people did around the boardroom, you've seen that evolution dramatically, and clearly Europe has been moving much faster than America in some of these capacities of, say, ESG and other areas. What did it feel like when you were starting in terms of governance and advice you were giving versus what you're sharing with people today?
Very good, and it's an excellent question, actually. It is true that governance 25 years ago was not fashionable. And boards actually were almost the backwaters of corporations, right? They were not making front pages, and usually it was an old boys network, rather ineffective, of people with a certain pride, but often not very effective. And it is also true that what I would call was the premise of ESG, let's say stewardship, became, the idea of being there for the long term with positive social impact. It's probably, I worked on the concept myself 10 years ago. This was sponsored by the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore, so it was becoming mainstream then. But the ESG trend, as it has been fostered by the investment world, by the asset owners and asset managers world, is very recent. And that itself, in my view, will have a fundamental evolution, which I can predict for you, Alexander, is going to go the governance way. I think the ESG world has been very focused first on E, especially in Europe, but somewhat in the US as well, carbon footprints, etc. Then it has been focused on S, diversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity. But the true driver of ESG, is the G. It should read GES, because if you think about it, right, what drives the true nature of the environmental or social positioning of a corporation, but the board of directors, or at least the governance system, the combination of the General Assembly, the board, and the executives, right, if you don't want to isolate the board. But still, the governance process. I have great examples of things going south or things going north. For example, I've worked with a World Bank investment in the Middle East that was highly focused, mostly on solar energy, so very strong from an environmental side. But that investment, it was a co-investment of the World Bank with a few other large actors. And they had the star CEO, and that star CEO negotiated a contract that under certain KPIs was giving him a fantastic payout. And he reached these KPIs. And suddenly there was a fight among the shareholders on whether that was acceptable in a World Bank environment to have CEOs that was paid so much. And they decided to fight legally on the deal. And that deteriorated to the point of the CEO created another company and being successful on another company, and the degradation of the original company on the ESG side. And so you see here an example of a company that looks good on ESG, but with poor governance is degrading, G being the engine. I can give you the opposite example. Finnish company Neste used to be the oil and gas company of Finland, a board that I worked with actually about 7-8 years ago, a board that had a very strong sense of environment. I remember asking them, the board members, what was their own personal carbon footprint. Already, 6-7 years ago, they knew each of them, 5 out of them, what their personal carbon footprint was. Well, I remember one of them mentioning his dog's carbon footprint, and 2 of them, telling me, please don't count business travel in there. So that kind of awareness, and that company actually decided to shift itself towards ESG. It has shifted itself to biofuels. It has become the largest biofuel producer in the world. And it has been, tripling its market cap while most of the oil and gas companies were dividing theirs by 2. And so the most successful, when I talk today to the boards of Shell or of Total, this company is the model that they would like but cannot emulate, because you see ESG, in my view, is very fundamental. And it's a sign that we have moved, and we are moving from a world of what I would call mechanical governance, separation, CEO, chair, number of independent, number of gender diversity on the board, mechanical governance towards what I would call a values-based governance, being there for the long term, leaving for the next generation something better than what we got, social impact, the overall thinking, and the stakeholder thinking the corporation, not only producing value for the shareholders, but understanding that true long-term value for shareholders is actually linked to value to stakeholders at large. And some marvelous examples from that side, for example, Mars in the US, which started in a sub-part of the business to pay suppliers not on the basis of their original contract, but on the basis of the values they were creating, and discovering that they were not only increasing the payment to the suppliers, but they were also increasing the value created by Mars and the profits of Mars in so doing. So yes, suppliers were being paid more, but they were creating enough value in the system that actually Mars itself was making more money. And there's that understanding, right, that the organization is not in conflict or in isolation of the world, that the 1980s transaction view, the classical Wall Street movie type of view is obsolete, and that there is a base of value creation that is very consistent to what I would call values-based governance.
I love that compare and contrast with then and now. And, one of the old stories would be if you go back, say, the 25, 30 years ago, you'd hear that sound of rip paper when a board meeting started because someone would be opening the board pack that had been snail mailed to them. At least that doesn't happen anymore. That's a good progress statement. But one of the things I'd like to talk about, there's a milestone along the way in your career as well when you founded IMD's Global Board Center. And I'm sure at that point, the world is, that was about 2011, right? So we're going a little bit over a decade ago. The world had moved on dramatically. It's moved on again soon, and we'll get to that as well. But what was the goal that you wanted to do there? Tell us about the great work that you're doing there in the center.
Well, first you have to understand that I'm a professor in a school, but I don't profess very much anymore. Most of my work is being with boards of large organizations and interacting with them, sometimes facilitating, sometimes assessing, sometimes only encouraging some perspectives. And this is the exact objectives that I had when I created the IMD Global Board Center. It was transforming governance, having a sense that after the great financial crisis, obviously the boards of the different large banks were underwater, and they were underwater because of the principle of independence, which in my view was a biased principle of governance. Many of these boards had plenty of independence on them, but these individuals, gentlemen or ladies, mostly gentlemen, were so independent that they didn't know the stuff and they didn't care. And so that created, in my view, a massive failure of governance. I remember in 2006, one of the great banks of the world, where one board member told me with a smile, because that was the culture at the time, with a smile, that nobody on the board of that bank understood the risk reports of that bank. And we are talking about $100 billion market capitalization at the time, which is massive. And so I took great pain at trying to figure out gentle level points. And I've been mildly successful, very mildly, because obviously this was too ambitious a goal. But I've been blessed with having a profession of education that can be levered higher. And by the way, I love my job. You understand that educating a board is not like education in university or for that matter in high school or kindergarten. It's all different types of education. You know well that matters expert in high school is doing a different job than a kindergarten teacher. And I feel in some ways I've become back a generalist. And that going to the governance level, yes, I use my finance skills, but I use also many other skills, whether psychological, whether, dynamics, whether risks, whether strategic. Today I was actually doing a reflection on how a CEO should exchange with a chair on strategic matters, and bringing all of that together and trying to impact governance for the better world. And this is why, by the way, I've been involved with actors that are so different, and sometimes actors that I certainly would not make friends with, but where I think even for them, for everybody, a better governance is better for the world. And so I'll go to companies or to organizations or to countries, for that matter, where, I don't have a personal kindness to, but I do think that within their own system, a better governance is going to bring them to a higher level. And after all, we can all profit from that.
Well, let's actually jump from, let's say about 2011, we were talking about before. Let's come back to today, and we were talking about ESG, and I would put out a hypothesis that COVID has dramatically moved forward. You never want to waste a crisis. The opportunity for boards to recognize how important all three of those letters are. And you talked about how the G should be first, right? So guess is what you were suggesting we recall it. But the environmental and the social, thinking about the human beings that work for their companies, the human beings that are their customers, how they've been hurting, how they can best support them, but also say, looking at how we saw the world changed for the better when people stopped traveling and everyone was locked down and suddenly the pollution started to change. And what you were talking about supply chains before, what does this mean? How do we pay our people? What should we be doing for the world? So I feel like ESG is now front and center if it wasn't already for an organization. And people are trying to think, what do I do about this? What does it mean? And it's probably not just a report anymore. It's not just factual numbers like financial data. It means so much more. How do you attract employees? How do you retain employees? So you're probably working with so many organizations around this. What does ESG look and feel like for the boardrooms that you're working with today, and where are they headed on this topic?
So this is a vast topic by itself. I can bring it from many different angles, so I'm a bit hesitant which way to go. First, it's important to realize that investors, asset owners, have become more influential. And so if I'm looking, if you want, at a triangle of the governance power, where each end of the triangle would be on the one side the executive and the executive team that was all powerful, for example, in widely publicly held corporations. And at another end of the triangle, I put the board. And at the third end of the triangle, I put the owners or shareholders. There is a tremendous increase of shareholder power in the governance triangle. And that is impacting not only ESG, but the views of ESG and the views of the corporate organization at large. And this is very intriguing. So the large transformations that you have described, and for example, I could go on how boards are working in new ways on stakeholder mapping and stakeholder engagement, and that has become much more sophisticated. I could talk about, materiality matrices, which is a tool that has become standard now on ESG matters. And by the way, not only boards are using, but shareholder activists as well, especially the ESG activists that are coming of age. I could talk about integrated reporting and how, the true reporting now is a narrative rather than only accounts. It's an intriguing perspective, right? That what is convincing is now the narrative with all the greenwashing and whitewashing possibilities that are behind. But I think the point that might be the most interesting from a governance standpoint is the fact that we're going to a world of huge transformations. And you've described COVID, and obviously, if you're thinking of the new responsibilities of an organization, even for the mental health of its employees, and not only of its employees, but all the workforce that is engaged around, the gig workers, the suppliers, all the people around, right? There is a responsibility now, it is felt, of the corporate organization for the mental health of employees, which is something unexpected that didn't used to be the case. If I'm thinking of all these massive transformations, I think the big point of governance today is how are we going to adapt to even further changes. I don't think we're at the end. I think we're at the beginning. I think whether you look at inflation and what is probably going to be a massive redistribution of value across ages and across corporations through the hike of inflation, or whether you look at geopolitics with what gets framed more and more as a West to China conflict, or Russia being very minor in that environment. Or if you're thinking of the technological transformation and the rise of AI and the incredible potential of substitution in which we could see a world of winners and losers, in which some corporations specialize in a high human capital while other corporations specialize in a high automated capital, and I would say mostly financial and technological capital. And so we're seeing a potential for transformation in the world that is absolutely massive. And some of the smartest individuals I deal with have recognized that. And they've transformed sometimes large corporate organizations in what I would call a portfolio of activities. A good example, and that's public information, is Danish company A.P. Moller Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world, which of course is at the heart of what's happening in the supply chain transformation of the world. And the representative of the family, there is a family holding, actually it's a foundation-based holding with strong influence of the family that owns not only A.P. Moller Maersk, the publicly traded corporation, which used to be one of the largest market caps of Europe, but other assets as well. And Robert Ugla Maersk has reorganized this as a holding with different pillars. So, for example, they've sold the oil and gas. They've bought a diagnostics business, in 2019, before COVID, called Genie Labs. They've bought a company specializing in circular economy, circular plastic firm. So they're diversifying across ESG, and they've made it a holding, taking assets out of the large corporation. They've made it a holding to be able to act as an investor, sell parts, buy parts, reconstitute the portfolio, and move their portfolio of activities faster. Which means that suddenly we have a much more complex governance. Another interesting example is an HSBC, for example, that has a strong franchise in Hong Kong, the most profitable of their businesses, while of course being very present around the West, in the UK, but in many other countries as well, in Canada, etc. And so an HSBC today has to look at the world with much more flexibility and much more subsidiarity of decisions. And suddenly the governance of these large organizations has to become not only more sophisticated, so it's not one board, it's many different boards with different subsidiaries, with different subsidiarity, different connectivity between the boards. And it also has to become much more agile and fast at transforming. And so if you think about it, right, my view is it a necessity to think of the corporation as a portfolio of activity, and what kind of corporations need to be transformed in such a portfolio, and what kind should rather stay in the building up of the corporate organization to a bigger level. So a fundamental governance question in front of the massive transformation of the world that is forthcoming.
Wow. That was an amazing way of describing what is just an incredibly complex topic. And people tend to think about it in very different ways, sometimes based on industry. You talk to so many different boards, where and how they cover ESG could be in different committees. So it's really hard to break that down. I think you made that something we could all grasp. And clearly you've been working hard about getting this information communicated across in a way that people can understand. And I'd love, for example, for you to share about your book. So the High Performance Board book is available, and people will be able to hear more about it and your detailed thinking. Specifically, I'd love if you would share your 4 pillars of effectiveness, because I think that'll be a great takeaway for all of our listeners.
Thank you, Alexander. So when I wrote this book, what I wanted was a guide that would help board members and chairs of boards, but also, individual board members improve the governance of their organization wherever it's based and whatever the organization is. Whether it's a school board, whether it's a church board, whether it's a multinational board, to gain the insights of what drives healthy governance. And in my view, governance is indeed like health. It's something that we work on a regular basis and that we improve incrementally. It's a bit like figuring out your diet, the exercise, your stress levels, etc. And working with my board, across time, I figured out that these four pillars were the determinants, right? And number one, of course, for the quality of a board is the people side. And when we think the people, we tend to think first of the composition and the competencies. A skill map or a competency map is typical of what a board starts working from. But it's not only the competencies, of course, it's also the diversity, the focus, and the dedication. So the diversity we all understand, and that could be a good discussion, maybe it's a whole session by itself about why diversity creates value and why it does not always create value. Because only well-managed diversity creates value. I work with some organizations with diversity is too large and there is destruction of value because of diversity, strangely enough, because it's very hard to align, it's very hard to figure out the right topics. And indeed, a third dimension in that first pillar is the focus. What are we paying attention to? I see boards with great individuals, with a good level of dedication, but they're just not discussing what matters. And the last dimension of the first pillar of people is really the level of dedication. You see, boards used to be the time where we shine at the end of the career. Not anymore, right? This is the place where we make the essential decisions for an organization and where we hold the ultimate responsibility, the fiduciary responsibility, but also the ethical responsibility for the organization. So number one pillar is the people, composition, diversity, focus, and dedication. The second pillar of quality governance, which is very at stress in many organizations, is simply the quality of the information you get on the board. And it's not only the internal information, it's the external information. It's not only the information you get from management, it's the information you get from others, from outside management. To me, it should be 50-50. It should be balanced. Internal, external, 50-50. Dependent from management, independent from management, 50-50. And also formal versus informal. Great information is a lunch with a union leader, or a breakfast with a customer, a chat in the elevator with one of the management team members, right? All of that is informal, but it has as much value as a formal side. Often we have stressed too much the formal side. And it's important to remember that some of the best governed companies in the world are family businesses where decisions are taking place during, the Sunday barbecue. The third pillar, so first pillar is the people. The second pillar is the information, the quality of the information. The third pillar is structures and processes. And I'm impressed how you can overcome a poor chair, a bad composition, with the right structures and processes. And so, the classical processes, right? The audit process, the strategy process, the nomination process, the evaluation process, the risk process, and the long list of processes and the classical structures, committees, board meetings, number of board meetings, board structures, etc. Again, a good work there can overcome a lot. I've been in organizations, for example, I did a governance review of the International Olympic Committee where we were challenged by the conflicts of interest of some of the board members. And how do you bring, and it's a very powerful organization in the world of sports. It is at the origin of the court of sports, the tribunal of sports. It's at the origin of anti-doping, etc. So it's a very powerful organization. And when there is conflicts of interest there, it's of course destructive to a lot in sport. And so the question was, okay, how can we improve things without changing the board members? And we could do a lot, actually, from the structuration of processes and from the creation of new structures, such as an ethics committee chaired by unquestionable external individuals, a former United Nations leader. And the fourth pillar. So first pillar is the people. Second pillar is information. Third pillar, structures and processes. Fourth pillar that takes you towards a greater governance quality is the quality of the dynamics. And the board dynamics, or if you want, the culture of the board. It has to be an open, direct culture, frank culture. And here I see many different cultures of boards that can work across nations. You know, a U.S. board in Florida is quite different from a U.S. board in California. And the Mexican board just across the border is very different as well. And so is a Finnish board from an Egyptian board, for example, right? So you have these massive differences of cultures. But somehow all these boards have to have a certain level of psychological safety, the ability for anybody to be able to raise a question safely. But also, and I don't want to stress too much psychological safety because regulators, of course, are paying a lot of attention to that, but also the need to be able to challenge strongly. So there has to be some strength, some power on the board as well. A combination of safety, but also, challenge and push, I would say. And here, what I like to do is to watch out for the red flags, the false yes, the consensual board, the disrupted board, and figuring out, pathologies of these dynamics that typically board members are well aware of, but hesitate to put on the table.
Well, that was an amazing run-through of a book that I think would be so informative, so much for our audience. We'll make sure we have a link to it in the show notes. And Didier, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your incredible insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
It was a pleasure to be with you, Alexander. Thank you for the great discussion.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Didier Cossin. So much knowledge and experience, such an expert in governance. And I love the way he gave it to us today. It's not ESG, it's GES. So we should all be thinking about how important governance is. So much information we can take out of today's episode. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be boardroom bound.